welcome back to the Morbid Moonlight 31 Days of Felissa Rose, which is my take on the 31 Days of Halloween Watch and Review a Movie a Day challenge, where we will be working our way through some of the weird and wonderful horror movies of horror icon Felissa Rose. Unfortunately today, we're actually going to be looking at a film that's neither weird nor wonderful. In actual fact, it's the complete opposite of both of those things, because what it is it's a Troma film. Maybe you know Troma films. I know they're way better known than they really deserve to be, but basically they're this kind of really cheap, tacky outfit that turns out deliberately shitty films like The Toxic Avenger or Poultrygeist, where the joke is basically that there's shit on purpose, and you usually get just a string of really bad taste gags that try to be as outrageous as possible because everything is just one big joke. Now, I have yet to see a Troma film that I like, and I actually try to avoid them when possible just because, you know, life's too short and they more or less represent everything that I don't want from a horror film, although it's debatable whether or not a lot of Troma films actually count as horror. To their credit, and I suppose this is something, a Troma film is in itself really its own kind of genre, but you know, I was willing to give this one a chance because unlike an earlier Troma film called Zombiegeddon that actually did feature a smaller role for Felissa Rose in her earlier years back in the genre, this one actually properly stars Felissa Rose, and to its credit, she does actually get quite a lot to do in this one. The problem is, of course, that it's a Troma film. Now, I know me just being bigoted about Troma doesn't count as a great review. If I know for a fact that I hate Troma films, then watch a Troma film and hate it, then that's just me affirming what I already knew, and more fool me for even watching it in the first place. But even allowing for my own biases, I think it's worth saying that the movie Slaughter Party is really a truly terrible movie, and here's why. First up, a bit of plot. Not that it matters massively, but what we've got here is that Felissa Rose is playing Tara, who is the sister of a victim of this murderous serial killer dwarf, played by Mr. Mighty Mike Marga. She goes out on this kind of weird camping trip out into the middle of the desert in the hopes of trying to get over her sister's death, and then her and her bunch of attractive friends all end up getting attacked by the lethal little person himself. There's this kind of police investigation and a mad scientist lurking about as well. It is, to be honest, more or less just a big hodgepodge that's an excuse to showcase whatever it was thought necessary to sell the movie, whether it was a bunch of young women in bikinis, necrophilia, lame bloody violence, lesbianism, or just really tacky bad taste jokes, and believe me, all of those things are definitely in Slaughter Party, that's for sure. But see, and this is the crucial thing, is that Slaughter Party is a film that starts off with gay dwarf rape before actually going downhill from there, and that's saying something. It's pretty just the usual kind of assault on good taste that you get with Troma films, but the problem with the whole kind of Troma idea is that stuff like that is only shocking or only really gets a reaction from you if you're not expecting it. When the only weapon in your arsenal is doing really tasteless, disgusting things in the hopes of getting a cheap snicker, then it's not really funny or shocking. It's just a Troma film doing that thing that Troma films do. So all the kind of stupid bad taste gore or horrible sexual acts in the world ultimately won't faze the audience that this film's going for, because they know exactly what they're getting themselves in for, and normies aren't ever going to get past the opening prologue of just incompetent, tedious, badly filmed riffing and lame gags. I know for a fact that a lot of this movie, the dialogue in it actually was improvised, which doesn't say much about the imaginations of the people involved. And that, to me, is fundamentally, I think, more than the fact that I don't find necrophilia or rape or severed cocks funny, is the biggest problem that I've got with Troma films in general, which comes down to the fact that if everything in your film is meant to be a joke, when the whole joke is we're shitty and we know it, then why do you ever need to even bother putting anything remotely watchable in your film? Why would you ever accept anyone involved doing a decent job when you can just say that bad acting is intentionally bad, or the effects are shitty because they're meant to be shitty, or the plot's ridiculous because it's meant to be? Why should you ever look at someone delivering dialogue like English is not their first language and tell them to try again when you can just shrug and say, hey, it's meant to be shit? Because the whole thing is that bad acting of that kind of spoofy variety that is actually funny, like something like maybe Leslie Nielsen in Naked Gun, is actually something that requires you to be able to act in the first place, to then go on and pitch a performance that's funny because it's deliberately stilted and wooden. A very good example of this would be a film like Larry Blameyer's The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, which is this kind of loving parody of 50s sci-fi B-movies that works because it's made by a director who knows exactly what aesthetic he's going for, and even though technically everything in that film's sort of knowingly terrible, it's very carefully thought out and planned and designed, because Larry Blameyer is a director who knows what he wants and puts a lot of effort into getting things just right. I think that's the key, that if you're making a film that's deliberately knowingly terrible, you have to be really careful to pitch it just right so it's actually funny and not just shit. In fact, that is one of the biggest myths in low-budget filmmaking, that you can just make something that's really tacky and shoddy, but it's funny because it's meant to be tacky and shoddy. In order to make something that's actually funny because it's knowingly shit, you need to be, at the very least, a competent director and have actors who can actually add that layer of self-awareness to what they're doing, not just chuck any talentless imbeciles at the screen and treat everything like it's a joke. Because a lot of films of this level that are actually very funny because they're terrible are the ones that don't try to be terrible, but actually try really hard to be good, and that's where you can legitimately laugh at things because they're a bit shit. Although to me, I'm always more inclined towards a film that's actually trying its best, no matter how cheap or technically incompetent it might be, because at least it's not trying to do this kind of thing, that kind of Troma thing, where everything's shit, haha. You don't need to bother with actual jokes or any kind of observational stuff about how cheap B-movies are bad, you just point and shoot and move on. Films where everything's meant to be a joke are often films that actually don't have any legit proper jokes in them, and that's just sheer fucking laziness in my opinion. Lazy and contemptuous filmmaking from people that think they can just chuck any old shit at us and we're meant to laugh at it, even though they haven't even bothered with any aspect of the filmmaking other than thinking of about 6 or 7 maybe really tacky, disgusting ideas like dwarf gets blowjob from severed head. That's about the level of art you get in a film like this, and by the way, that was done at least 25 years before this in Bloodsucking Freaks. It wasn't funny then, and it's not funny in this. I think maybe the one thing that this film actually has got going for it is that Felissa Rose actually does give, strangely, a really decent performance, and it's really that thing of, it looks like she doesn't know what film she's in, because she actually does try her very best, which kind of marks her out as maybe the only person on screen that actually does a good job, decked out in some really cool early 2000s fashions. There's also a few cameos of note, including of course Ron Jeremy, who's basically here as a joke, so you can say that here's a film about a rapist killer dwarf that features Ron Jeremy, and we all laugh because that's such a great joke, but the reality is that he gets maybe about a minute screen time and is just a name to stick on the box to add to the hilarity, and by the way, he is by far not the worst or most embarrassing actor in Slaughter Party. Less hilarious, though, is one of Felissa Rose's fellow horror legends, Brink Stevens, who somebody will crop up in a few more of the films that we're talking about this month. Brink Stevens is somebody who I think has actually probably done more films than even Felissa Rose, but they're roughly kind of contemporaries and sort of work in similar circles. I mean, she quite literally phones this performance in as she plays this kind of hacker, sat in a corner of what I understand is actually her living room for about 2 minutes, just so old Lloyd Kaufman could stick another well-known name on the DVD cover. It's one of the weirdest things as well, speaking of Lloyd Kaufman, because even though I really don't like any of his films, I've always found Mr. Lloyd Kaufman himself to actually be quite a funny dude. I kind of like his shtick and his persona, and he gets this nice little kind of bad taste cameo here, as is usually the way with most Troma films. He generally appears on screen in I think every single Troma film that I've ever seen. But really most of the cast are unknowns, and because a lot of them are also young attractive women, that means that a lot of them are cast because they're happy doing nude scenes. To be honest, yeah, there's quite a bit of nudity in this film from good looking women, but ultimately, so what? They're shot in the dullest, crappiest way possible, with that really kind of flat, grubby kind of what people think of as a porno aesthetic to everything that's really the least erotic thing that you can think of. And really, this is one of those films that rather than just saying fuck you to everyone involved with, I actually do feel sorry for quite a lot of these people, and that's a pretty major no-no. I feel sorry for the women who have to get attacked by Mighty Mike Murga whilst they're half naked, just kind of rolling about in the dust, getting scraped and bloody, because even if this was a great film, those scenes look tough to film, and I can't imagine a Troma set is the safest and most supportive environment to work on, where the ethos is very much get it shot and move on to the next scene as quickly as possible. All the nudity is really cynically leery and tacky, and any sex that we get is actually very carefully contrived to be as fucked up as possible. We've also got a really kind of headache-inducing, screechy pantomime performance from Mr. Ford Austin as the evil doctor in the film's last act, and it's just a pain to sit through because it's like a really, really tacky kind of ultra Jim Carrey bit of overacting that just goes on and on. If you're not familiar with Ford Austin, and I imagine most people aren't, then he is a guy, by the way, whose sense of humour runs to having this picture of himself as his IMDb profile pic, because, you know, it's funny, isn't it? So then add to that this slew of really, really awful loud songs that are plastered on over the soundtrack, seemingly completely at random as though the director just got bored and thought, why the fuck not? And to be honest, most of them don't hurt things, because it's not like there's actually a film or a narrative or an atmosphere to hurt. It's just one more annoying thing to add to the mix. But the very ending, though, is less kind of Troma than it is tapping into the kind of vogue for the tied-up and tortured splatter films of the early 2000s. And once again, it's just more nastiness for its own sake. And again, I actually do feel quite sorry for Felissa Rose having to do some of this shit, just because I know that she's a lot better than this. And this is kind of really tacky, bottom-of-the-barrel exploitation shit that makes me sorry for no-name actresses being involved with, let alone somebody that I know and respect, like Felissa Rose. It seems that this film more or less cooled Felissa Rose's relationship with Troma films for a good while, and she never really did another solid Troma movie after this point, certainly not in a starring role at any rate, and that's great. I mean, I know it's easy to sneer at cheap stuff and say that it sucks, but if I'd been involved in Slaughter Party in any way, I think I would have to step back and have a serious think about what I was doing with my life, because it's really just one of the most joyless, cynically tacky, unfunny films that I've seen in a very long time. To its credit, though, it does actually have a lot of Felissa Rose in it, and I'm thinking probably a Felissa factor of 7.5 out of 10, because she is the main character, first in the cast, slap bang on the cover, and totally the one that gets the whole movie going. It's her first totally starring role since Sleepaway Camp, and you do get a lot of Felissa Rose for your bucks, but it's just a shame that she is trying so hard in this because nobody else is. I'd like to say watch it just for a performance, but I just end up feeling sorry for having to do some of this stuff. I think really Troma movies are the kind of thing that real, proper actors should never mess with. Just because, you know, what is the best thing that can happen? I mean, Felissa Rose tries to keep her dignity here, but no Troma film has ever called for people to actually act in it. So other than being a name to help sell a film, most Troma films just opt for ultra cheap nobodies to be in their film, or else just weirdos that actually get off on stuff like this, who are welcome to all the rape and necrophilia and sleaze that they can shake a severed dick at. I can laugh at comedies, I can enjoy unintentionally bad films, and I can step back and appreciate something that's just trying to muck about. But Slaughter Party is really just, to me, a complete train wreck of a film. Even if the idea of really bad taste, sick sex and gore appeals to you, it's such a dull, lazy, badly made film that even those aspects seem lifeless as hell, even for a Troma film. It's like watching porn that you're not into, where it doesn't even fulfill a really basic but dubious function, and you just end up feeling bad for everybody involved and like you've wasted a good chunk of your life. I'm going to stick a nice fat 1 out of 10 for Slaughter Party, because Felissa Rose is good in it, and because there's probably one feeble as fuck joke that I sort of smiled at here. But please, try not to watch Slaughter Party if you can help it. The interesting thing, though, is that like a lot of earlier Troma DVDs, the DVD of Slaughter Party is very hard to get your hands on, and I ended up paying a fuck ton for it, to be honest, which is about as masochistic as it gets. I can only hope that somebody out there is buying up all the copies and setting fire to them in the hopes of ridding the world of this film. I mean, I have seen worse movies, but there is nothing whatsoever better about the world because Slaughter Party exists. And I think that should probably wrap things up for day number 3 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. Thanks an awful lot for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you've got any Felissa Rose horror films that you desperately want me to cover, please let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to get to it by the end of the month. Feel free to tell me as well that I'm totally wrong about Slaughter Party and that it's a masterpiece, and if you will, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. That would be a great help, and hopefully I shall see you back here for day number 4 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose tomorrow. We shall see you then, alright?